Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for joining the channel again today. So far in the videos on this channel, we've looked at some of my construction projects on my own property, and I wanted to expand outward to show you the surrounding area in the suburbs that I'm in. Of course, this is winter, and these suburbs are pretty common for what you would find in most large metro areas. So obviously a downtown center or a large city itself would look different, but you get an idea of the general layout and pattern. It's a very grid-like pattern for the suburbs. And part of the reason I want to share this is because I think it's a good reference point when thinking about layout, urban planning, design, built environment, all those things, things that I'm interested in exploring a little more, especially in relationship to other countries. And we'll get into that later as far as the other country bit. But so far in this video, I want to make it more of a reference point, and so pull out some observations and then use it as a base of reference for looking at some other places and just kind of sense how the design qualities of the houses and the yards and things might affect not only standard of living but pace of life and things like that. So obviously you can see in this suburb the streets are quite wide, and part of that is because of street parking, but also in these suburbs, since we do get a lot of snow, we need to have extra space for snow plows and things. But you can just see how the houses are spaced apart. They're not clustered like you might find in a small village or in a traditional town, at least in North America. And in fact, these suburbs really got started in their construction after World War II. So these are slightly smaller lots and smaller houses than what you would find in newer suburbs as you get into, let's say, the 80s and 90s for sure. And I'm sure many of you know what those suburbs look like, but the basic pattern is the same. Each individual lot is roughly the same size. Typically you get a smaller house, usually a one-story. In that case, you just saw a two-story and then a garage. And based on the municipal ordinances, you're typically allowed 2 extra structures on the property. So these types of suburbs are highly regulated. They're not quite a homeowners association, HOA, but they are pretty restrictive in terms of what you can build and how big. And even as far as the lot size goes, you're only allowed 35% of the lot size to be impermeable surface. That just means that any surface area that's covered with concrete or house is considered impermeable. So you need a certain percentage above that is grass or wooded area. So what you see is what you get. There's really not much wiggle room for design or even splitting the lots so that you can cluster houses and make things a little more, what's the word I'm looking for? A little more clustered as far as living conditions go. So kind of interesting to see these houses. Many of them were built in the 40s, and you can see the standard of living back then. People didn't need a lot of space, and in fact, I personally like the smaller houses. They're more affordable, and you find that once you live in them, you really don't need all that much space. So many people have it as their goal to move to the suburbs, and that's kind of their step up from maybe an apartment building or a downtown spot. Here you have a vacant lot. There used to be a house on that. But many people also, they want to upgrade from the suburbs to a larger plot of land in a more rural area so that they can build a bigger house or have more options as far as maybe livestock or outbuildings and things. So just take a look. Many of you are already familiar with this, but I think I'll end up showing you some things that are not familiar to many of you in North America, and I think it's going to be an interesting compare and contrast, even as far as the lifestyle and what the amount of space you find in the suburbs does to daily life and the rhythms of life. Typically what you find for sure, and it's kind of a well-known issue in North America, that people are isolated in their houses and they don't really communicate with their neighbors, even though everyone's relatively close. I mean, I just walked around the block here, and it's not very hard to get around, but it's somehow very isolating in an odd way. So there might be some critical mass of space or square footage, I don't know, that keeps people psychologically kind of bound to where they live. So I find that interesting. And here's an alley. The alley basically is used by garbage trucks, but sometimes you'll see people driving down them. But not that many people walk. And you can see even on my little jaunt here, there's really not very many people outside unless they're in their car. But this is also an odd time of day. People are working and things too. So, but kind of interesting observations nonetheless. And you can see a lot of people have fences up to conceal. And a lot of that, what I've found, is due to the fact that some neighbors are just so nosy that and concerned with what's going on in their neighbor's yard, that you have to put up a fence so that you don't get complaints for silly things. So there's really no community here as far as like socializing and people getting together in the neighborhood. There's no square where people meet up, and that's all fairly unfortunate. But if you like to stick to yourself and be isolated and that sort of thing, this might be the kind of place for you. So that's a little tour of the suburbs south of the Twin Cities in Minnesota in January. And switching views to a different part of the metro, we have a strip mall next to some apartment buildings. And you just saw in the start of that section a very common scene in most of suburbia most of cities that were developed post World War II. A lot of strip malls, commercially owned spaces that rent out slots to businesses, and those businesses turn over every few years or several, or maybe decades. Sometimes they last a long time, but there aren't really individual buildings, and that's typical of anywhere. But the strip mall itself is a staple for North American development, I guess. This is a part of town in Minneapolis near a park, and Minneapolis is known for its parks, its nature parks and things, and they typically get pretty good acclaim for a lot of their city planning. And you can see there's a lot of variety here in terms of strip mall, businesses, living quarters, and then also some more natural areas too. So it's a nice, refreshing change from the suburbs in some ways. And it is nice to have a variety between the different regions of the Twin Cities. Here is a famous park, Minnehaha Falls Park. Some very beautiful falls, especially in the winter when the ice freezes and you get those big blocky chunks along the river there. And this is a unique part of the Twin Cities. It's nature kind of nestled right in between all the buildings and the noise and the traffic. And this is typically where you would find people walking around in these parks. But unless you get closer to downtown and the city itself, you're still kind of in car country, where people are mostly relegated to their vehicles. It's kind of in and out and get to the shelter, get to the car. Not a lot of people just walking around. And that's true even in the summertime. So obviously winter's cold, people don't go out as much, but just the way things are built up is kind of inhibiting to life outside. And so again, that's a question of is this a consequence of how things are laid out and built up, or is that just the culture? I tend to think it's the way that the built environment is set up. So these little oases of nature are a nice getaway, but you find that a lot of them are pretty broken up. And so you have like residential areas, commercial areas, natural areas, and they're all fairly separated. So you don't get a nice blend between them. And that's all part of city planning and zoning and things like that. So that affects the culture, it affects the lifestyle. Down here by the Mississippi River, obviously some very beautiful views and a nice getaway, but not something that you would necessarily see in every part of the city. Here is a completely different part of the country. This is actually in South Carolina, Greenville. And I wanted to get footage of this because I'm actually on my travels right now. But it's interesting to see how, maybe 1,500 miles away from where I was just at in Minnesota, the houses are laid out kind of in a similar way. You can see there's similar spacing as far as lot size goes and layout of the streets in a grid pattern. Obviously different trees and things and different climate here in the winter. But a lot of what you see in suburbia generally is going to be the same regardless of state. And of course it's nice to have the extra space and the large house, but what you see here again is a lack of any kind of plaza or center that can gather people, and you certainly don't really see anybody walking around. It's pretty much exclusively car traffic, except for the odd runner or jogger. And I believe down the street there might be a park, but it seems that nowadays those aren't quite utilized as much. Here, this would all probably be residential zoning, and there of course there's a church mixed in, but any kind of shopping or amenities you would have to drive down a little ways to get to. So a little bit of character here, something different from what you would see in Minnesota as far as like in that last house you saw the porch posts, kind of a, I guess, neoclassical look that you don't really encounter much in the Midwest. But otherwise, fairly similar in a lot of different ways. So interesting to compare and contrast. But I could keep walking here. It would basically be the same thing for miles. So basically, that is the theme of this video, is just to show you the layout of suburbia, which is familiar to many people, but this provides a good contrast to the next place that I want to show you in the next video, to demonstrate different ideas with urban layout and in the next case village planning. And that video will be in the Republic of Georgia, where a lot of the villages and towns have been there for literally centuries, and in some cases over a millennia. So I think it's fun to compare and contrast old world and new world, and just to see how that affects lifestyle, or how lifestyle affects the way we build and lay out our cities. So thanks for watching.